Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining me. My name is Takle Sabatu, Principal of S2C International. This Exporting 101 Process and Fundamentals is primarily designed to assist the small to medium-sized companies jumpstart their operation. So if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to post them in the chat area, and also please adjust your volume or speaker volume so that you can hear me well if you have any issues. Alrighty, I think we're going to just jump into the agenda and briefly talk as to what we're going to be covering. I'll talk briefly about how to get started in the export business, and also with that, we will cover the four essentials for export success, introduction to the export compliance, the export process required and other major documents. We'll also cover briefly the Incoterms 2010, mistakes made by exporters, and we will end with resources. Well, let me just kind of remind everyone that exporting is not a right, it is a privilege which can be taken away or revoked if rules and regulations are not followed. So make sure that you comply with all the regulations, including submitting the required documents. Now, to get started, now let's talk briefly about license and also a company, whether you need a license to export or you need a company to export. Now, as far as license is concerned, there are certain products that would require a license to export from the government agency that regulates those products. And we'll talk briefly about that in regards to compliance. As far as company is concerned, you don't have to have a formal company. You as an individual can export, provided that you meet all the requirements to export a specific product. Meaning, if a product requires a license, then to more or less obtain a license, or if the product requires some kind of a certification or permit, then you have to obtain those. Literally, you don't have to have a formal company, but you still can export as an individual. Now, as far as filing documents is concerned, you can file them yourself, but highly advisable if you hire a freight forwarder to ship your goods. Some freight forwarders help only on the freight side, but some customs brokers help on both importing and exporting. So I think the idea or the message is you should have some help at least at the beginning for the first, second, or third shipment, then you can make a decision based on that. Now, there's plenty of help that is available for exporting for the U.S. companies. So try to take advantage of the free resources that are available, including a one-to-one consulting by different government agencies like the U.S. Department of Commerce or the Export Assistance Center, or in some cases could be the Small Business Administration or the Small Business Development Centers, and including the SCORE, the Service Corps of Retired Executives. So take advantage of all the resources that are available, and I'm sure you will benefit from them. Now, let's talk briefly about the essentials for success. What do you exactly need to be successful in exporting? That's kind of a very broad, and that could take a long time to answer. But what I'm going to do is just to briefly highlight four key essentials for export success, meaning that you should consider. Of course, you can add any other additional topics or areas that you think can help you successful, but I think these are some basic and definitely if you haven't considered them, to consider them now. Now, the first one is planning. Of course, planning is everything, it's a blueprint, it's a roadmap. So have some kind of a plan in a written business plan. Of course, you might have it all in your head, but that might not be a long term. You might be forgetting it, or for some reasons you don't address what you think it was initially that you thought you will address. So planning is a key. Create a business plan and go for it. Commitment. This business is not a business where you can find or identify or become very successful in a short period of time. It's going to take some time, and it's going to take some commitment, and preferably a long-term commitment. The first shipment might not go right. Maybe the second shipment might be a little bit even shaky, and hopefully the third shipment will go all the way. And after that, relationship, culture, and business practices certainly are key to conducting business. Depends on the culture that you are working with, and try to understand their business practices and also what their needs are from a cultural perspective, so that you can have a good relationship. Preferably also to create an interpersonal relationship, meaning to have a relationship on a personal level rather than just having a relationship. Finally, knowledge, and that's pretty much what we're trying to do here, but documents, shipping, payments, marketing, financing, Incoterms, name it. We have to learn so that we can avoid costly mistakes. So those are some of the essentials that I think are important, and definitely you can add more to this four essentials if it can help you to become successful. Now, let's talk about compliance. Excuse me, my title of this slide should say export compliance, but for some reasons the title didn't come out. Export compliance, and more specifically, whether you need an export license or not. Now, to comply with the government regulations, US government regulations in this case, there are four basic questions first you have to answer. What item am I exporting, or what is the product that I am exporting? Is it a commodity? If it's a commodity, it is a furniture, could be, right? It could be an equipment, it could be a textile, and so forth. Or is it a software? For example, a retail package software, or something that you download or upload, email or fax, or even telephone conversation. Or is it a technical data, a design or a blueprint, and such other items? So you really have to specifically identify what your item is and what your product is, because that's going to help you or to determine whether you are going to need a license or not. Now, the other thing that you have to ask is, where is my item going? To what country? Or where is the final destination of the product, or ultimate destination? Because there are certain countries that the United States doesn't have, for whatever reasons, a relationship. So a sanction or an embargo, or a special control that the United States have, that you probably are going to need a license to export to those countries. So the country of destination or ultimate destination is very important to know. And then, who will receive your item or your product? That is the ultimate also end user. There is the BIS, the Bureau of Industry and Security, have a list of what they call denied party list. The denied party lists are a list of individuals or companies that cannot purchase, or goods cannot be sold to those individuals or companies that are in that list. So it's your responsibility as an exporter to check that first. And finally is what will they do with my item? That's also very important for the government. What will be used? They might sell it for one purpose, but the buyer might use it for a different purpose. If they do, then that is your responsibility as an exporter. So, especially on items that have a dual use, let's say, for example, for fertilizers, right? Where you can do it for multiple purposes. And you might sell it for one purpose, but the buyer might use it for a different purpose. So from the government point of view, you should have known what the importer or the buyer is going to use the product. So make sure that you answer these 4 questions, key questions first, before you move on to the next step. And then there might be other additional items that you need to know about your specific product once you answer this 4 basic questions. Okay, moving on. In some cases, there could be a red flag, and you need to be aware of that. And if you see any red flag, then don't ship the product. That's as simple as that. Customer address on the BIS denied person list, as I said before, and customer not willing to disclose the end user as to who will be using the specific product, willing to pay cash for large purchases, no business background, and unfamiliar with the product. And the product or the service incompatible with technical levels of the country, and routine installation training or maintenance denied. These are some of the red flags. There is a huge list of that, or many lists of that, at the BIS.doc.gov website if you want to look them more, or if you want to look more than the list that I have here. But the point is, make sure that if you see any red flag, not to ship your product, or investigate more about that product before you ship. All right. Some of the agencies that control export, this is just a kind of a partial list: Department of Commerce, Energy, Nuclear Regulatory Commission, Department of Interior, Justice, Treasury, and the state. All this and more have more or less an authority to issue a license for a specific product. Now, remember that there is no centralized place where you can obtain for different products. You have to go to the agencies, each agency, whatever the agency regulates that product, to obtain a license. All right, let's talk briefly about the export process. And in this case, I have a US exporter and a Brazilian importer. And in a typical transaction, there's also going to be involved with the bank of the exporter and the bank of the importer. Now, the first step in the export transaction, as you can see, is step number 1, negotiation. And that's where the buyer and the seller negotiate about the type of invoice, whether the buyer needs a pro forma invoice first before he obtains the commercial invoice, and the type of documents that the buyer might be able or will use to clear customs that he might need from the exporter. So that's a very important, in addition to negotiating the price and who's going to ship and when it's going to be shipped and so on. There are other documents that might also be required for the importer and the exporter to have, for the exporter to export the goods and for the importer to clear his customs. Now, once the negotiation is done, And then the second step is the buyer will go to his bank and pay for the goods, or make some kind of arrangement with his bank to pay for the goods. Now, the Brazilian bank, in this case, will send the documents to the US bank or the exporter's bank. And that is the documents that requesting the documents that the buyer will need to clear goods, and the buyer had paid already, or it will pay later, depending on the arrangement with the bank and informing the US bank. Then the US bank will inform the or notify the exporter, and which is step number 4, as you can see. And the exporter, that's a critical moment for the exporter. You have to look everything, all the documents, and so on and so on, and make sure that he comply with all the items that were negotiated in step 1, and then ships the goods. Remember, if the exporter doesn't have the required documents and ships the goods, then the importer might not be able to clear his customs. So the goods will be stuck in the importer's country, which is not good for everybody. Okay. Now, once the exporter ships the goods, he obtains documents from the shipping company. If it was via ocean, then he will get a bill of lading. And if it was via air, then airway bill. And takes those documents to the exporter's bank, or to the US bank in this case, and the US bank will make the payments. And then the importer, step number 7, the importer claims goods. Now, this is a very simple process that I have, and it can be complicated, but what I want you to have a basic understanding is that there are 4 parties in this transaction, and each party has some kind of responsibility as far as the process is concerned. So it can get so complicated, but I think this is a basis for an export transaction, and definitely on the type of transaction and the requirement, the documents, and so on and so on. It can get a little bit more complicated as well. All right, moving on. I'm going to talk about documents, and documents. It's all about documents when it comes to importing and exporting. So get the documents right. There are 4 categories of international documents, and that's, I think, the best way to simplify them. Otherwise, it will be very difficult for these documents to identify, because there are a lot of documents. In fact, in a typical transaction, many experts say it involves about maybe 35 to 40 documents. Some of the documents you might not see them as an exporter, but certainly it might be between banks and banks, between insurance and the bank, and so on and so on. Or even a simple document that the carrier might give you as a receipt, that's considered as a document. But for our purposes here, to just have some idea, I categorize them into 4. Transaction documents, payment documents, shipping and insurance documents, and regulatory documents. Now, the transaction documents are pro forma invoice, commercial invoice, sales invoice. Those are typically in a transaction for payment or as a contract. Payment documents are letter of credit, and also advice letter of credit, and any document that's related to payment. When I say payment in the transaction documents, I meant bill, the bills that's going to be sent, because a commercial invoice is pretty much like a bill, right? And the sales contract identifies all the requirements to make that bill. So payments and transactions are two different in a way. Shipping and insurance documents, bill of lading, airway bill, packing list, and insurance certificate. Those are very important documents as well. And when it comes to the regulatory documents, shipping, shipper's export declaration, and certificate of origin, and also certificate of inspection. Certificate of inspection is when the buyer asks the seller to inspect the goods by a third party, to be inspect the goods by a third party before they are shipped. Alrighty, now let's jump into the payment systems. Advance payment, open account, consignment, document recollection, and letter of credit. And I'm going to just quickly go over this concepts or these ideas of payment. Advance payment is when the buyer pays in advance to the seller, and that means that the buyer is taking a lot of risk. Open account is when the seller ships goods to the buyer, and then the buyer pays for the goods. So in this case, the seller is taking, or the exporter is taking more risk. And consignment is, again, more risky than that of open account because the goods have to be resold by the importer for the exporter to get paid. Okay, and document recollection is involves banks also because the previous three payment methods, advance payment, open account, and consignment, they don't necessarily have to be, banks have to be involved in those transactions, with the exception of the buyer or the seller, cashing the check or cashing or collecting the payment. Document recollection, the banks get a little bit more involved when it comes to documents, but not necessarily as they will be involved in a letter of credit. Now, a letter of credit is what? A letter of credit is a contract between the exporter and the importer's bank, that the importer's bank will pay the exporter if he complies with all the terms and conditions of that letter of credit. Okay, and here is a kind of a risk assessment of using open account, document recollection, and so on. And as you can see, for the exporter, there's high risk when the agreement between the buyer and the seller, or between the exporter and the importer, is in an open account. And for the seller, payment in advance is very, very low. Okay. On the opposite side, if you can see on the importer side, the open account is best for the importer, and there is a high risk for the importer in payment in advance because he will or she will pay in advance to the seller. Okay, so it all depends on what payment method or term that you're going to be using. There's going to be some risk associated with it, but some of it could be a high risk and some could be a low risk. All right, let's jump briefly into the Incoterms. Incoterms 2010. Just kind of a little bit of history. I think it started in 1936, where a bunch of attorneys and also experts on trade, bankers maybe, got together and created or started this terms. Now, this has been reviewed or revised several times. And for the last 4 decades, I believe they have been revised every 10 years. So we have 2010 now, we had 2000, and we had 1990, and before that we had 1980, and so forth. Okay, and what does Incoterm deal with? Incoterm deal with a risk of transfer. Transfer of goods, okay? And transportation and insurance costs, as who is going to pay or who will be handling the process or whose obligation is, and documents import and export clearance and security as well. Now, Incoterms doesn't deal with transfer of property rights, meaning title is transferred through a separate contract, not through an Incoterm. Price to be paid, payment methods that we've talked about have nothing to do with Incoterms, and also doesn't deal with anything that is act of God, for example, or force majeure. And or unforeseen circumstances. So we need to know as to what it deals and what it doesn't, so that we can effectively use Incoterms. Now, 11 of them, any modes of transportation: X-Works, FCA, CPT, CIP, DAT, DAP, and DDP. Okay, and sea and land waterway, FAS, FOB, CFR, and CIF. All right, we're not going to go all of them, but I just want to highlight a few. X-Works, the seller makes the goods available at his work to the buyer, and the buyer comes up and pick up the goods and take it to the final destination. And you can use any modes of transportation for this. DDP, delivered duty paid. Seller is like a domestic sales in the destination country. In other words, you're going to be delivering that goods to the office or to the named place of destination of the buyer. So it becomes like a domestic transaction in the buyer's country. FCA, which is very common and increasingly being used for containers and other goods to be shipped. Seller's risk is until delivered to the named carrier, and that carrier is named by the buyer. Okay. Okay. So in other way, the seller will pay the transportation costs to the named carrier, and the buyer's risk after delivery to the carrier. And you can use any modes of transportation to deliver it to the carrier. Okay. All right. This is a very important one to know more, because you might be using more of this. Now, export delivers according to the customs of port. Risk transfers when goods are loaded on ocean freight collect car. Ocean freight collect meaning that the buyer is going to pay for the ocean freight. But this is now mostly used for commodities. Containers, as I said, are primarily use the Incoterm FCA. CFR, cost and freight, similar to FOB, except that the ocean freight is prepaid. In other words, the buyer will pay the ocean freight. CIF, cost, insurance, and freight, same as CFR. Okay, and only insurance is taken care by the seller rather than the buyer. Okay. Some of the common mistakes made by exporters: a lack of export business plan, complicated transactions, failure to obtain export assistance, lack of sufficient commitment, insufficient care when selecting agents, distributors, and chasing orders. These are some typical mistakes that are made by exporters, and I think it is good to be aware of them. Finally, I guess I have a couple of slides. The role of freight forwarder very important partner. You want to make sure that you select a freight forwarder that is knowledgeable about the area, preferably, and the product that you're shipping. And they can play a very important role, especially at the beginning, because there might be a lot of unknowns, as we've talked about before, when it comes to documents or compliance and other issues. They are experts, so use them at least at the beginning, and then maybe you can decide whether you want to continue to use them or not. But certainly, you should consider using them for the first, second, third, or even fourth shipment to see how it all works. Now, you have to give them the power of attorney for them to handle on your behalf, whether it's a freight forwarder or a customs house broker. And some of their activities, the documentation aspect that we've talked about, and how to get the goods in a best possible way, export license requirements, and marine insurance, warehouse and distribution services, hazardous material shipping, and so forth. So make sure that you work with a freight forwarder before you jumping yourself to take maybe possibly huge risk. Now, as far as resources is concerned, this is the basic guide to exporting, which is online. You can access it. You can go to our website, which is stc international.us, and the Learning Center, and it's chapter by chapter. And definitely, I will take advantage of it if you don't have a hard copy. Basic Guide to Exporting is one of the kind of most popular and common textbook or guide used for exporting. So I highly recommend that you consider having it online. Basically, what you have to do is you just download it, and or you can purchase it, I believe, a hard copy through different companies that sell the book. I think that's pretty much what I have. I appreciate for your presence here, and we will take some of the questions.